Today's theme is preparedness. Always be prepared. That's the motto for the Boy Scouts, and they sure showed that preparedness when gay scout leaders challenged their hiring policy. The preparedness we will discuss will be about preparing for unexpected changes in the environment. In one case, it will be about a mostly desert country preparing for history's worst snow blizzard. In another example, we will look at how prepared an 18th century modern European army was for a change in the weather and a longer campaign than they expected. But in our most important example, we will see how well prepared one person was for a dearth of reference material on an episode he promised to his listeners about history's worst snowstorm. Always be prepared. That's what ears pinned and tails taut means, right? Greetings, kittens. Welcome to the Podcast of Doom, the podcast devoted to epic failure analysis. My name is David Appleson. I want to thank you for all of your continued support. It is great to hear from you. I know I'm extremely excited to return to the podcast, and it sounds like many of you are excited to have me back. I was hoping not to disappoint in the second episode since the sabbatical, and you'll have to tell me if I did or did not meet your expectations. In this episode, you won't get just one catastrophe, you will get two. Today we will discuss two of history's worst blizzards. That wasn't in the original plan, but hopefully my sweat and toil will result in your listening pleasure. Sometimes you make great plans depending on elements and resources that you are certain exist. Such is the case with many of the events highlighted in this podcast. That turned out to be the problem that befell this particular episode. A while back, I planned to do an episode on what I thought was an excellent topic, history's worst recorded blizzard. That shouldn't have been much of a problem, right? The blizzard took place in 1972. That's a fairly recent time as history goes. In 1972, television had been around for a while, and you could make a case that the 1970s were sort of a golden age for broadcast TV news. Camera crews were still going into Vietnam and capturing footage of events that would be shown that day in the United States. Print magazines were popular. Print newspapers were popular. People communicated instantaneously by telephone across actual wires. News spread quickly. Not as quickly as today, but relatively fast. This blizzard took place in Iran. Iran is a big country with a big population and modern technology, including communications. When big events happen in Iran, we hear about them right away. At least we do today. And this was history's most fatal snowstorm on record. It didn't kill hundreds, it killed thousands. This should have been big news in 1972. It would be huge news if it happened today in North America or Europe or in any number of places. But as I was reminded by one of the research librarians I worked with when I was researching this topic, it is not always easy to get news from autocratic societies. Many times autocrats see bad news about disasters as a reflection on themselves. That may have been the case for this particular disaster. The ruler of Iran was Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and he was a tyrant and a dictator. The United States placed him on his peacock throne in 1953 when they overthrew the democratically elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh. I figured the Shah would be more sympathetic to the Western press, since it was a Western government he owed his crown to. Unfortunately for us, he was not. There's very little information in English about the 1972 blizzard. There may be more information about the blizzard in Farsi, the native language of Iran, but I don't read Farsi, and I did not even find any Farsi language books about the blizzard. It affected thousands of people, so I know there are still thousands of survivors alive who know about the blizzard. But I could find no book on the subject that was published during the time of the Shah or the time of the Ayatollahs that followed. Somewhere out there is a great story, but I think it should be written by someone who knows Farsi. Therefore, I will tell you all that I learned about the Great Iranian Blizzard of 1972. It occurred at the end of a 4-year drought in Iran. Iran doesn't get many blizzards because of its southern location on the Persian Gulf. But it does have many mountains, and this storm hit in the mountainous western region of Iran, which is not too far south of Russia, a place known for getting a lot of snow. The initial snowstorm started on February 3rd, 1972, and lasted until February 9th, and it was followed by another snowstorm that began on February 11th. It is categorized as a blizzard because wind speeds reached in excess of 35 miles per hour, which is the definition of a blizzard. That and reduced visibility to less than a quarter mile. I don't know just how high the wind speeds reached, nor do I know how limited visibility was, but I'm guessing it was pretty bad. I do know that as much as 26 feet of snow fell during those 7 days. That is not how high the snowdrifts were. That is the measurement of how much snow fell. That is higher than a 2-story house. For comparison, Aspen, Colorado, a famous and very exclusive ski resort town, receives on average 15 feet of snow. For the year, Iran received 26 feet in 1 week. That is an enormous amount of snow. It is like a hurricane of snow. According to the newspaper articles, 200 villages were wiped out. They just disappeared under all of that snow and the subsequent floods that followed the snowmelt. At one point, the temperature fell to minus 13 degrees Fahrenheit or minus 25 Celsius. That does not include the wind chill, which is how cold the wind feels against exposed skin. The storm covered an area the size of the state of Wisconsin, or an area that's larger than England and Wales put together. The snowstorm snapped telephone lines, buried commuter trains, crushed automobiles, and entombed villages. People trapped in the area of the storm were left without food, drinkable water, heat, or medical aid for days. In Shaklab, rescue workers dug through 8 feet of snow only to find 18 frozen bodies and not one survivor from the village of 100 people. One survivor who was rescued said that 5 persons that were trapped in a car for 5 days in a mountain pass had frozen to death. During the storm, an American female college student and her 2 male companions disappeared while mountain climbing. A 5-man rescue search team that went out to find them also disappeared. A deadly flu virus attacked the survivors after the snow began to melt. Those types of events are probably more common than we suspect, as viruses are the ultimate opportunists. That's about all that I know about this particular blizzard. If you are listening right now, and you know someone who survived this blizzard, or you know someone who was in the blizzard, please drop me a line. Since we still have quite a bit of time remaining, I thought I would stick to the topic of blizzards and talk about another particularly fatal blizzard that hit an army of Swedish soldiers in northern Norway. This incident, which happened in December of 1718 and January of 1719, is more popularly known as the Carolean Death March. Maybe it goes back to the Middle Ages and the end of the barbarian invasions, or further back to the decline of the Roman Empire, or even further back than that. Whichever it is, it seems that up until about the end of the Second World War, Europe was involved in a lethal multiplayer chess match. Europe has long been composed of numerous principalities and kingdoms. Each kingdom attempted to occupy as much territory as possible, but each kingdom also made certain that no one kingdom became more powerful than all the other kingdoms combined. This led to numerous wars and a constantly evolving complex web of alliances. This scenario went on for a very long time, destroying a lot of property and killing a lot of people along the way. The British Empire, in their competition with the Russian Empire, referred to this struggle as the Great Game, but they may just as well have called it the Great Futile Game, because there never was a final winner, but there certainly were a lot of losers. Enter Sweden, under the leadership of Gustavus Adolphus in the early 17th century. Under his capable leadership, showcased by his military brilliance, Adolphus took Sweden from being a minor player in the far north of Europe to being the 3rd largest country after Russia and the Holy Roman Empire. He turned the tide during the 30 Years' War, bringing victory after victory to the Protestant side. Sweden was still a major power into the 18th century. This is the story of how that great Swedish Empire came to an end. Like our aborted story on the Iranian Blizzard, it is a fight against nature as well as against human behavior. In 1697, Charles XII, descendant of Gustavus Adolphus, and known to his subjects as Karl XII, ascended to the throne of Sweden. Taking the crown at the age of 15, Karl faced a difficult situation, preserving the empire that Gustavus Adolphus, Christina, and the two Karls before him had put together. That empire included not only Sweden, but Finland, Livonia, Ingria, Jutland, Skonia, Estland, and several Baltic possessions. He did not have a large army like the Russians or the Habsburgs, but he had a very good army. They were known as the Caroleans, named after the king's father, Karl XI. The Caroleans were strictly disciplined. They were known for high morale, swift offensive tactics that gave the enemy little time to respond, and a fraternal religious association that contributed to a great sense of camaraderie. Karl personally led this army on an immense campaign through Central Europe and right into southern Russia. It was there, at the Battle of Poltava, that his exhausted army suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of a new rising star, Tsar Peter the Great. Following that humiliating defeat and the loss of a number of Swedish territories, Sweden faced a trade blockade that crippled their economy and diminished the king's prestige. In order to secure a stronger position and to end the blockade, Karl decided to attack and conquer his great Scandinavian nemesis, Norway, who at that time was part of the greater empire that included Denmark. Karl would lead the main body of his army on an attack in southern Norway against the Dano-Norwegian Confederation, led by King Frederick IV. Yes, those were the days when a head of state mounted his steed and personally led his army into the field of battle. You're not going to see President Obama or Prime Minister Cameron or Harper do something like that. Sure, Putin could picture himself riding a horse in front of a column of tanks, but only if he was photoshopped into the frame. Of course, there's a good reason why heads of state don't lead their armies into battle, and we're going to find out why that is. While Karl headed south, he sent his second-in-command, Lieutenant General Gustav Armfeldt, north along with 10,000 well-trained Swedish soldiers and a number of highly talented Finnish soldiers. His mission was to capture the strategic city of Trondheim in northern Norway. Karl expected Armfeldt to accomplish this task in 6 weeks because the timetable was crucial to his master plan of dominating Norway. Because the expectation was that Trondheim would be conquered in just 6 weeks, no preparations were made for a fall campaign, much less a winter one. Clothing and supplies were light to make travel faster. Plus, nothing says quagmire more than being told to pack your long johns when it is only August. However, from the get-go, the weather would not cooperate. Northern Europe had just gone through several years of famine. Crop yields were low all over. In summer, the heavy rains came, and the roads turned muddy, making for difficult travel, particularly for the heavy artillery. On August 9th of 1718, Armfeldt and his army of 10,000 marched out of their fortified base in Duved, Sweden, prepared for a quick campaign and a speedy return home before the first northern winds could even begin to stir. Armfeldt's counterpart, Major General Vincent Berda, was in charge of defending the walled garrison inside Trondheim. If he could defeat Armfeldt, his northern army could link up with the southern army to crush King Karl. Once Armfeldt's force crossed over the Swedish-Norwegian border, he used his spies to track down the movements of his opponent and prepare for the proper direction of attack. At the fortified redoubt of Stana, Norwegian soldiers blocked Armfeldt's advance. Rather than engaging a well-defended position under inopportune conditions, Armfeldt bypassed Stanaer by taking the long route over rugged terrain to Färsdalen. The plan succeeded, and on September 1st, the Swedes took the Norwegian town of Skåne with minimal losses. However, the next leg of the journey would be more difficult and more dangerous. Armfeldt called the route a sum of bad roads. Norwegian marksmen attacked the Swedish troops as they proceeded through the passes. A cold, steady rain began to fall, and provisions were already running low. The swollen Stirdal River proved difficult to cross. With the well-fortified town of Gevingassen waiting for them on the other side, Armfeldt chose to wait for the raging river to subside. The general sent orders to Duved to send more provisions and supplies, but the roads were now so muddy that travel by wagon was impossible. Without the needed supplies, the army turned back and headed to the nearby village of Virdal to pillage food and clothing. Although the Caroleans were well disciplined and did not want to anger the local Norwegians, they took by force things they needed to survive. Those who fought back against the soldiers risked losing their lives. By this time, King Karl had heard about the setbacks affecting Armfeldt's campaign, and this delay was upsetting his grander plan to subdue Norway. The king sent a courier who arrived on October 18th with orders to march on Trondheim immediately. Armfeldt quickly gathered his forces and headed toward Trondheim. The general chose to use the road that was in the best condition, even though it meant taking a longer route. Along the way, the Caroleans even managed to construct a floating bridge that was over 700 feet long in a little over 10 minutes. All of Armfeldt's delays benefited Birde and his defense of Trondheim. Given extra time, he gathered an army of 8,000, which now outnumbered the remaining forces under Armfeldt's command. Also, the slow, conspicuous march to Trondheim had ruined any chance of Armfeldt catching Birde by surprise. Birde, meanwhile, had brought up several warships, which he anchored in the Trondheim harbor. These warships could use their cannons to attack the Swedes. Having reached the outskirts of Trondheim and the fortress of Kristiansand, Armfeldt decided to let the roads into town dry out so that he could bring up his heavy cannons. Without the cannons, he would be unable to penetrate the thick walls of Kristiansand. Birde, holding the defensive position, was in no rush to take action. He knew that time was on his side. During this waiting game, both sides suffered. The supplies of food and clothing were whittled down. Soldiers and citizens were attacked by the flu. The people of Trondheim pleaded with Birde to go on the offensive and take the attack to the Swedes, preferably somewhere far away from the city limits. But Birde knew such an action would take away his main advantage and give the superior Swedish cavalry a chance to attack his forces. No, he would stay behind his thick walls and fortifications. By December, Armfeldt still had not attacked Trondheim, and winter was settling in, colder and more bitter than usual for that time of year. Rumors started to spread around the Swedish camp that their king was dead, killed somehow in battle. Well, the rumors turned out to be true. On December 11th, the king was shot through the head while inspecting Swedish trenches that were very close to enemy lines. Because no one actually saw what direction the bullet came from when Karl was hit, there were many theories about who actually killed him. The most plausible theory being a Danish marksman who would have been close enough for a kill shot. But some darker theories blamed his brother-in-law, Frederick, who would eventually assume the throne. Medical forensics was still in its primitive stages in the 18th century, so we may never fully know. When the news reached the defenders of Trondheim, they rejoiced in celebration, cheering and shooting off volleys from their muskets. The war was over. Well, almost. Even without official confirmation of the king's death or orders, Armfeldt chose to take his army south to Heldtalen. On Christmas Eve, Armfeldt gathered his remaining soldiers, about 5,800 in all, and lit bonfires outside Heldtalen's small wooden stave church and along the frozen river. Already his poorly clad men were dropping from starvation and exposure. Those fortunate enough to make it inside the church sang traditional hymns such as "A Mighty Fortress is Our God." Cold and hungry, the soldiers outside plundered the local farms. Those farmers who resisted were shot on the spot. For wood, they tore up bridges and the flooring of the few available farmhouses. But this small community did not provide much in the way of food, heat, or clothing. Hundreds of soldiers perished during the stay in Heldtalen. It was during this time that Armfeldt received official notice of Karl's death, and his orders to return to Sweden immediately. He chose to take the shortest route available, going over the Bukhammaren Mountains to Tidal, and from there over the mountain range to Fort Järper in Handal, Sweden. So far, Though the winter had been cold, there hadn't been much snow. Armfeldt decided to forego skis. On January 8, 1719, the Carolean forces left Heldalen and marched toward Tidal, a distance of more than 20 miles. As they headed up into the mountains, a large snowstorm blew in with heavy winds and snow. Most of the soldiers were able to take cover in the thick forests, but as many as 200 perished during this leg of the journey. On January 11th, they arrived in Tidal in scattered groups. With their supplies running even lower, the Caroleans plundered the surrounding communities, bringing many hardships to the local populace. The reduced army was gathered on the farms of Aas and Ostby. Although most of the residents had fled, hearing about the approach of the Swedish army, the sick and elderly, as well as a man and his wife who had just delivered twins, stayed behind. More plundering took place, but those Caroleans who ventured too far out risked attack by Berda's ski units. That night, a few lucky officers got to sleep indoors, while the rest of the army huddled outside next to bonfires. Their boots had been worn down, and their jackets were threadbare. That night was one of the coldest in memory. Frozen branches cracked in the wind. Armfeldt coerced the farmer Lars Ostby to be their guide through the mountain passages to Handal by taking 2 of his kinswomen hostage. In small detachments, they left on January 12th under clear skies. The weather was cold, but there was no snowfall. It was a journey of some 35 miles. But just as they reached the mountain passes, a severe northwestern storm blew in. This time there was no shelter from the biting wind, and hundreds more soldiers died. By 2:30 in the afternoon, the storm had hit full strength, just as the troops were reaching the treeless mountainside of Øyfjellet. Lars had taken the army as far as he could. Beyond the mountain pass lay Sweden. Armfeldt released the women hostages. They made their way back to Tidal, passing dead and dying soldiers all along the trail. They safely returned to Ostby farm to find the last Swedish detachment, who had determined to wait out the storm. As darkness fell, Armfeldt realized he was going to have to make camp on the exposed mountainside near the lake of Boostvallen. Without the shelter of trees, the wind blew ferociously. Finding decent fuel for fires was nearly impossible. In a desperate effort to keep warm, the soldiers set fire to dwarf birch and heather. But as these woods burned quickly, they resorted to throwing other available fuels into the fire: rifle butts, saddles, and sleds. Men froze in their places, whether it was lying down, standing, or crawling. The wind and poor visibility also had the effect of scattering the soldiers so that they were no longer a coherent force. There are reports that an officer who tried to maintain order around a bonfire was knocked over and tossed into the flames by the enraged soldiers. For those troops that were separated from the rest of the group, chances for survival were slim. In the snow, wind, and wilderness, it was nearly impossible to find the trail once it was lost. The tracks made by the guide and Armfeldt's advance party disappeared quickly beneath the falling snow. The soldiers followed several routes to Handal. Some followed the Enon River the whole way. They broke holes in the ice to see which way was downstream and thus toward Sweden. Others took a shortcut over the north ridge of the mountains. Still others chose the straight route to get there as soon as possible. Those who followed the river did find some shelter from the storm, but they had to struggle through hip-deep snow. Many soldiers abandoned their equipment along the way. On January 17th, they reached the town of Handal in Sweden. It turned out to be no town at all. It was little more than 3 farms and contained little in the way of food or clothing. Frostbite was so rampant that the field surgeon was kept busy day and night filling buckets full of amputated hands and feet. Armfeldt himself was suffering from a minor case of frostbite. Bonfires were lit to guide in the straggling soldiers. Rescue teams were sent out to retrieve lost weapons and equipment. Word was sent forward to Duved that food and transport were needed right away. Survivors streamed into town on the 18th and 19th. They thought they would find shelter from the elements now that they were in Sweden. But the tiny hamlet offered little in the way of protection. The few buildings there were soon overfilled. There were reports of suffocation from soldiers being packed in too tightly. Most of the soldiers were forced to sleep outside next to bonfires, which did not offer enough heat to stay warm. Many more died during the stay in Handal. A soapstone found later at the site stated that more than 600 people were buried there. Their final stop before rescue was in the redoubt of Duved, where the campaign had started. It is estimated that another 700 soldiers had died, weakened from frostbite, starvation, and disease on the road to Duved. The majority of survivors were afflicted with frostbite. The only medical treatment possible was amputation to prevent gangrene. It is estimated that more than 3,700 soldiers died during the retreat from Trondheim, making it the second most fatal blizzard following the Iranian Blizzard of 1972. Another 451 soldiers were dismissed after the campaign, as the frostbite damage they suffered had made them unfit for military duty. Many of these crippled veterans were forced to beg in order to survive. Post-Northern War Sweden would not be the first or last nation to abandon its veterans. On January 18th, Norwegian Major Emahausen set off toward the mountains on the trail of the Swedish army. There he found hundreds of dead Caroleans. The horses that were still alive ran around without riders, while others lay collapsed, still harnessed to fully loaded sleds. The drivers of those sleds sat, eyes open, with glazed expressions, still holding the reins in their frozen grip. The Norwegians took a great deal of booty that winter. They found masses of swords and rifles and 6 small cannons abandoned on the mountainside. The locals plundered the dead of their boots, coats, weapons, and other valuables. Rifle barrels were used for hardware in fireplaces or for axles and grindstones. After the people were finished, the beasts of prey came to visit. Wolves, wolverines, and foxes discovered an abundance of carcasses. A local legend told that for many years these mountain tracks were the best for hunting fur-bearing animals. Every other year in Tidal, in the middle of winter, there is an open-air theater production depicting the events of the Carolean Death March. The production is called Armfeldt. As an epilogue, Armfeldt survived the ordeal and lived to the ripe old age of 69. At least it was ripe and old for those days. There is a 3-minute video that I have posted to the Podcast of Doom website. The video displays all of the empires and nations in Europe and the Middle East as they evolved and de-evolved over 6,000 years. Not all of the evolving and de-evolving represents wars. Some of it is alliances or coercion. Some of it represents political marriages and inheritances. But a great deal of that change is represented by war. It is a story of 6,000 years of struggle and man's often vain attempt to stake out a greater claim than his neighbors. That is the story of the Swedish Empire. It is the story of a proud and capable king, humiliated in battle, who attempts to regain his standing and dignity through more war and conquest. It isn't the story of Sweden. It is the story of humankind. We may be at what seems like a lull now, but we are still in the middle of fighting this continuous struggle. Thank you again for listening. I greatly appreciate all of your support. Please tell your friends, your enemies, and your frenemies about the show. You can find the show on iTunes, Stitcher, and Blueberry, and I'm working on expanding our reach. You can visit the website at www.thepodcastofdoom.com or like us on Facebook. Please do email me with comments, questions, or suggestions. The email address is podcastofdoom@aol.com. Thank you for your support. It is so much fun to be back. In the next episode, we will look at the Banqiao Dam failure in central China of 1975. Over 100,000 people lost their lives due to the flooding, but more than 11 million people lost their homes. We will examine the human errors and natural occurrences that led to this horrendous disaster. Until then, keep your ears pinned and your tail taut.